Hello and welcome back everybody to another giant episode of From the Heart. And for today, I have something most special. Something that I've been sitting on for quite a long time as I've been a little scared of doing it knowing exactly how long this video would be. But with every single one of my Swamp Thing videos that are a mere 40 to 50 minutes, I think this one may actually push it. And I think it's one that absolutely deserves it. We are going to be going through Swamp Thing Love and Death. I have the lights turned down low and I'm taking a big shot on this and having my entire screen be wildly out of focus. So hopefully that doesn't happen, and I will be reading out of this enormous absolute Swamp Thing book. I would very much recommend you go get it, although it is about $80, sometimes $100 depending on when you buy it. But for real, I think I'd recommend the original artwork, as they are the same exact story, the same exact artwork, but this one is merely reshaded, recolored. It's a little interesting. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it loses a little bit of the grit, but it's a little bit easier for me to see in this dark light. But for anybody who doesn't know anything about Swamp Thing, I implore you to go watch the other videos first before this one, or this is going to be just a touch confusing, as a lot has happened throughout this story, as this one will actually complete the storylines of Mathew Cable, Anton Arcane, Swamp Thing and Abby Cable's sort of will they won't they love situation, in one of the most beautiful ways that I've ever seen a romance story go. And while this won't happen until the second part of the video, and yes, this will be split into twos, as this will span across Swamp Thing Volume 2 all the way through. So we're gonna cut that in half, and the only reason that I'm really doing this is because it is such a long story and I need to be able to put these videos out at a reasonable time, so I'm not slacking. And you people, you glorious people, will have something to watch. And I do hope that you guys are excited. I know I've been talking about this one through a bunch of different videos, but we are finally going to step into it, and I gotta say, this one absolutely tops the last one, alright? I know that video was called Alan Moore's most terrifying story that he ever wrote or something like that, but this one absolutely takes the cake. And the only reason that I would even say that about the other one is because I hadn't read this one yet, alright? Once again, Jerry's Stories comes in clutch with just telling me, you know, you need to read this. And once again, I went, okay, I will. And ever since then, I think I've read this story about 10 times now, just trying to absolutely bury it in my brain. I've tried to record this video several different times, and I just could not get it right. But today, I'm feeling particularly amped up. I'm feeling particularly knowledgeable about this story, and I think it's finally time that once again, I absolutely force myself to make this video, because I know at the end I'm going to absolutely love it, and I know you all as well. As this story just conveys so much, we actually get to see a little bit of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing's version of hell, which I find incredibly dark and insanely well written, as every Alan Moore story is, along with some very neat concepts on actually bringing people back from the dead, people that you might even recognize. There's a few moments in this book that I was like, hey, I've watched a lot of Last Podcast on the Left. I have a pretty good database for serial killer knowledge and things like that. And it turns out that I was wrong, or maybe I wasn't. But anyways, their names are extremely similar, and let's just go ahead and jump right into this book, because otherwise I'm just going to continue the ramble, and I really just don't know where to start this. And where this story is going to begin is with a rather beautiful tale about Swamp Thing actually kind of burying his past, actually putting aside these feelings that have haunted him for so long, of this man that he may or may not used to be. He still can't really tell whether he's just a plant matter that's kind of enveloped his consciousness, or if he's completely left Alec Holland behind and become an entirely new organism. And the interesting thing about this beginning issue is that it's actually not written by Alan Moore, or the artwork is not done by Steve Bissette or John Totalbaum. And it does look a little different, and it does look a little bit goofy, but the story at hand I found to be very cool, as we actually get to see a few memories from Alec Holland and his wife themselves. The moment before they died, something that we've kind of tread through a lot of times at this point. We understand that this man was exploded in an explosion, clearly. But overall, I do think it is an important part of the story, as it just brings more character growth for the Swamp Thing, and as you get through more and more volumes of these things, with Swamp Thing meeting Constantine for the first time ever, and all these different situations, him learning about new powers, it just shows how strong of a character Alan Moore could write, and it's made me want to seek out more of his stories. And while I have done that, I think it's finally time that we dip into this book. So let's just get started with the very first scene. As we're looking at a very bleak looking night with Swamp Thing just digging a giant hole, filled with the wet cold rain of autumn, as he begins to dig deeper and deeper, wondering just how deep is enough to bury one's past. And with this little bit of a prelude, we will cut to the next panel where we will actually see Abby Cable sitting right next to him as they're just kind of walking through the swamps and having themselves a decent little time before something very peculiar happens and something that maybe sets Swamp Thing off. It looks nice in autumn, doesn't it? Incidentally, you're not looking too bad yourself. Isn't this funny? What's happening to your skin? Has it happened before? No, I was not in touch with the seasons before. Anything dropped off yet? And with this strange saying coming from Abby Cable, just kind of wondering what exactly that would mean, and Swamp Thing's face is definitely conveying the same kind of confusion when she suddenly changes the subject and notices a bird off in the distance. And Swamp Thing begins to tell her that it's just a blue heron, and he begins to kind of ask her how she has been. After all, if you haven't seen the last video, a lot has happened. She ended up going to a new school, Jason Blood was introduced, and somehow a giant demon has actually escaped out of a Ouija board, something that could have been possibly pushed by a person that maybe we know from the very beginning of the story, something that may come full circle in a very interesting and a very unique way. And Abby just kind of goes on to say that she's perfectly okay, that all this handwriting and all these different things that she was doing in the last couple weeks is essentially just nothing to worry about, and that basically her white hair makes her seem a little more distraught than she usually would be. And at this point, it's perfectly acceptable why she would be distraught, because her husband has basically died in a car crash and mysteriously came back when a giant fly-like creature or demon or whatever that might be, that might also be answered in the rest of this book, has actually brought him back to life. And on top of all that, literally being attacked by a demon who used anybody's fear around him to actually morph and change into this strange, amazing looking creature. Basically, a lot has happened to this lady. Even being taken by Jason Woodrue, it seems that every single time she goes anywhere, she is being taken away by a bad and awful craziness. Alright everybody, I had to take off the flannel. It is insanely hot in this room. I got this little light, I got a bunch of curtains on the window, and on top of that, it's about 85 degrees outside. So just bear with me. But from here, Swamp Thing begins to start asking about Mathew, a man that he hasn't seen in a while, and a man that through all the different volumes that we've kind of gone over on this channel has depicted a lot of kind of demonic powers, kind of bringing about all these different oddities, all these strange women, and something that Abby Cable has been very suspicious of late. This man who has been an absolute drunk through most of their relationship, throughout most of their marriage, who has seemed to taken a sudden turn after the car accident that happened in the last issue. Me and Matt are fine. He's really picked up, you know. He doesn't just sit around anymore, and the drinking stopped. He's actually out looking for a house for us. A house? No. And the money. At Elysian Lawns? Oh, that's tremendous. Just the way it's working out and everything. After that incident with the demon creature, I thought it would all be, well, I don't know what I thought, but it was amazing. They just explained everything away as mass hysteria. So, the home's just carrying on as normal, whatever that is. Oh, say, I was meaning to ask you, have you noticed how long it's taking for the flies to die off this year? Our motel is full of them. I wonder if it was, I don't know, something to do with glasshouse effect or... And at this point, Swamp Thing is noticing this very strange apparition just kind of walking around the forest. And who this would possibly be is Alec Holland himself, as we get this very strange and kind of funny picture of Swamp Thing just gasping at this thing, and Abby kind of notices that Swamp Thing is very upset about something. And she merely says his name, she says Alec, and she keeps asking him if he's going to be okay. And at this moment, Swamp Thing can no longer kind of deal with this. He's very unsure on how he actually feels about this man who he used to be, or this man that he never was. This man who he's completely embodied all of his memories and his consciousness, and he's still kind of struggling to be his own self. And when Abby says his name once again, Alec, he absolutely flips out, screaming to never call him that name again. That Alec Holland is dead, and that he will never be coming back. And from here, we just see Swamp Thing stomping off, as Abby has no idea what has stricken this man, or what he's seen out in the forest. And from here, we will be cutting back to a few more shots of Swamp Thing just digging his hole. The thing that we see in the beginning, as this will finally begin to lead to some of the memories of Alec Holland and his wife just having a good time, before this man was literally burned alive, submerged in the swamp, and arisen became the creature that we love and know so much. How deep do you need to bury the past before it will stay dead? And where are you? What are you? You're not Holland, and I'm not Holland. Holland died in an explosion. I have his consciousness, his memories, but he is dead, and I will not be haunted by myself. And as Swamp Thing is chasing Alec Holland's apparition through this woods, it begins to walk away. And at this point, Swamp Thing is feeling very emotional, not actually wanting him to leave, and actually wanting to know why he's even here, why he's been haunting him for so long in these cold and damp swamps. And he begins to follow him, and where this actually leads him is back to the old barn, back to his old house, where when he was a human, or at least when this apparition was alive, used to live with his wife, creating the biorestorative formula, and something that would actually alter his life from this point on until it was so painstakingly taken away. Here, where it began, still standing, but barely, naked rooms, filthy wet and ash, a soiled shred of upholstery, its faded pattern once familiar, home. And as he begins to walk through this old place where he used to live, we actually get this very touching little moment between Alec Holland and his wife. Just a little slice of life where they're just kind of enjoying each other's company, and something that I actually really appreciated is through all the different Swamp Thing stories that I've read, I've never really gotten to meet Linda Holland. But I think Lynn Wein, the man who actually wrote this very first issue, did a very good job at actually just conveying, like I said, a little slice of life between a man and his wife. Hey Skinny, did you make it this morning? Well, yeah, of course Oh, the bed. I knew it. You never tuck it in properly on my side. I always know when you've made it. It's like you've signed the quilt in the bottom right corner. You have to lift the mattress right up. And there's something very familiar between me and my girlfriend as she actually says that exact same thing. Alec Holland just continues to kind of read his book and give out a classic But after his wife is done and she's just kind of looking at herself in the mirror, he looks over and he tells her that she's going to look really good when she gets old. And she just kind of reminisces that this is the exact same thing that he told her when she was 17, that she was going to look very good when she was 25. And he basically just tells her that he means it, that essentially she just has very good bone structure, and it's something that he very much admires about her. No, I meant your bone structure. You're going to be beautiful for a long while. Well, I'd rather you wear me out before I was 30. Couldn't we just be rich for a long while instead? Yeah, why not? Listen, if this biorestorative formula pans out, we might even be enough to be rich and beautiful. Yeah, well, I'll be rich and beautiful, and you'll be rich and skinny. And they both just kind of have a nice laugh together when suddenly Alec Holland reaches over to his wife and he asks her if she's cold, and she says no, and she asks him if he's still reading, and he also says no. As we see a Swamp Thing just kind of sitting in the background watching this memory, he feels the love and the pain of actually losing this. Something so tender and sweet. And from here, another memory emerges. Something that would happen in the next couple of days, or something that would happen in the next month, when three strange men actually approach this building and start asking Alec Holland to give them over the biorestorative formula, the thing that will eventually be his demise. And from here, Swamp Thing just kind of realizes at this point that he will not be able to do anything about it, even though he wants to warn this man of the future, of things to come, that he will never be able to change this event that has led up to the point of where he is now. Save it for the boys in blue, Ferret. My wife and I will sleep a lot better knowing you three are behind bars. Sorry, we can't accommodate you, Doc. Bruno. And this man named Bruno swings a left hook across Alec Holland's face, knocking straight out on the floor, and Swamp Thing lunges forward, trying to grab this man as his arms are just passing directly through him. And as Alec Holland is laying there unconscious on the floor, the three men begin to strap the bomb or the dynamite or whatever this explosive device is underneath his desk. And at this point, Swamp Thing is screaming that he needs to wake up, that if he'd only just wake up, that everything could turn out differently, that he could finish the rest of his life with the wife that he's always loved, and not be cast upon all this weird craziness that has continued to happen throughout Swamp Thing's existence, being shot down by the government, being frozen and unthawed by this mad scientist, and actually having to stop him later from exploding the earth, controlling all the plants around him to increase the oxygen flow 10 times, until eventually everything dies off and the only thing left is the plants themselves. But nonetheless, this can't happen, and Swamp Thing cannot do a single thing about this. And suddenly Alec Holland wakes up, thinking that these strange men have actually left, when he suddenly hears a very mysterious ticking noise. And looking underneath his desk, he is absolutely shocked and will be blown away later on in the future as he notices his bomb strapped underneath his desk. And what he does next is actually try to defuse it before it can go off. And at this point of the story, I was a little bit confused as I don't really know where Linda Holland is. You would think she would have died in the explosion as well, but she must be just away at this point. point. Even though this man is still in the same exact pajamas that he was in the last scene when we actually seen them both together, it was just something that I didn't quite understand, and I really could use some more Linda Holland lore. So if any of you guys actually know a good spot to start with that, where I could actually read a little bit about Linda Holland, maybe she has her own comic franchise or something like that, that would be absolutely phenomenal. But as his fingers are shaking, trying to pull apart the wires in front of him, basically it explodes. And once again, we get the shining shot of Alec Holland running up to the swamp, completely engulfed in flames, being burned alive as he's trying to make his last bet for life. And Swamp Thing is watching this all. There, it is done, all done. But where is the body? For hours I sat and watched and waited, and nothing, almost nothing. And as he continues to sit down, looking out towards the swamp where Alec Holland's body is actually plunged, waiting for something to show where he can actually find his old body and finally bury his past once and for all. He sees something rising out of the water, and it is actually himself. The biorestorative formula running through his old body has now created him, and he's watching a memory that seems not too long ago. And as this past Swamp Thing just kind of walks up, and it looks like they're about to shake each other's hands, he realizes that this is also just a memory, and not exactly something that he can touch. You can see me, hear me, but I have so much to tell you. Your future, things that you must know. And as this past version of himself merely holds up his finger telling him to just be quiet, Swamp Thing looks over at the water and he sees a bunch of bubbles emerging. And at this point, he knows exactly what must be done, and he knows exactly how to find his old body. When suddenly Swamp Thing lunges towards this past version of himself, and it merely begins to disappear. Nothing. An empty space makes empty gestures, and I have dug an empty grave to fit a vanished body. But that is what you were trying to tell me. The body didn't vanish. It was the mind that vanished into the greenery and absorbed the spoiled flesh, creating a new organism and creating me. The mind vanished and the flesh vanished, but the bones remain. Down here in the cold, all those dark years, you must have been lonely. Come, I've prepared a place for you. Let us hope that it is deep enough. And with this touching little segment of the story, with Alec Holland realizing that his old bones, this thing that has been left alone for so long, completely forgotten, completely untouched, and how lonely of a death this must have been, he finally gets the chance to bury his old self. And with this, he is put at ease, but he realizes that there is no marker here. Nothing to actually mark the man that he used to be, and nothing to mark the amazing mind that he used to be. And he merely looks to his arm, and with this changing of the autumn, and with the changing of his body, he sees a giant root just kind of growing up his forearm, and he basically just rips this off, sticks it in the ground, and this is where Alec Holland will finally walk away in peace, knowing that everything is going to be okay, and knowing that he will no longer be haunted by his past self. He's there. I know that he is there, and I know that he is smiling, but I don't look back. And with the touching conclusion of Alec Holland finally being able to set his past at rest, actually finding his old body and sticking it to the ground for once and all, to stop being haunted by himself, this is where things are going to start picking up. This is where the story is going to start getting very fast. We're actually going to meet a lot of characters that we've seen through a lot of different comic books. A place where we'll actually get to see Jason Woodrue once again, as well as the Joker. Something that I found very cool as a little reminder, and something that the Sandman also likes to do, is to kind of remind you what universe you're in and how just connected all these different things are. And where this is going to start is with Abby Cable finally figuring out what exactly has been going on with Mathew this whole time. And also where we'll finally get to see what exactly happened to Mathew on that fatal night of the car crash, when he was visited by that strange fly who seemed to be offering him some kind of deal. Something that would actually restore his body, and something that would actually kind of change his life for the better, making him a better person, or making him somebody completely different altogether. She ripped all their clothes off, tearing them up. They were dirty. They touched her skin. She tried to burn them, but her hands were shaking, and the matches kept going out. In truth, she was a little crazy by this time. It was the smell. She couldn't get rid of the smell. In the shower, she used up all the soap, the shampoo, the bubble bath, and the perfume. The smell was still there. Have you ever burned an insect with a magnifying glass? Just once, long ago when you were a kid and didn't know any better. There, you know it, and you know the smell. When the soap wouldn't get rid of it, she went to the kitchen and fetched the wire brush that she used for scraping the potatoes. 20 minutes later, she passed out. 20 whole minutes. Even then, she could still smell it. And with this amazing little bit of writing from Alan Moore, kind of explaining the madness that Abby Cable has been going through, using this analogy of actually burning bugs with a magnifying glass, and something that I found so incredibly spot on to paint the image, to actually bring the smell to your nose of exactly what this lady is going through. This manages to be an insanely giant bit of foreshadowing that I still didn't expect on a first read. But from here, we just get this awesome artwork of Abby Cable laying down on the floor, looking off into insanity as we see the strange face coming off of her backside, and something way too familiar. Something that if you read the first volume of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, or actually know who his greatest nemesis is, you might know exactly what is about to happen next. But throughout the arc of Love and Death, this is going to kind of cut between a few different timepieces. As from here, we are going to cut back to Swamp Thing and Abby Cable actually meeting each other once again. And whether or not this is in a dream, it does say it's in a dream. I think she's just trying to escape into a time where what is happening is not happening. And this will be explained later on in the future in an extremely satisfying manner. She could smell it in her dreams. The dream had started out so nicely. She was in the swamp, and he was there, and they were friends again. Hello, Abby. It has been a long time, and I've missed you. I thought, well, you know, after the last time I saw you, I thought you didn't like me anymore. I'm sorry. I know I made you mad. I kept calling you Alec, and I know that you're not Alec, but I can't get used to calling you anything else. Abby, it doesn't matter anymore. You can call me Alec if it's easier. I can? Oh God, I thought you hated me. I thought just when things were going right for me, I was going to lose you. And then they were both laughing, and then she hugged him, and he hugged her back, and she couldn't breathe, but that was okay. He whirled her around, and her feet were no longer touching the ground, and she buried her face in his chest and breathed in a scent of life, and loam, and autumn, and it smelled good. Not like this. Not like this at all. And as we're getting this amazing artwork of Abby Cable being basically naked and being surrounded by all these different centipedes and all these different leeches, foreshadowing to things slithering and terrible, we're going to be cutting to another memory. Something that happened just a little bit before she was actually rendered useless onto the floor. Something that happened before her mind was actually shattered by the truth and the knowledge of what has been going on this entire time. As we cut to the next panel, and we see Abby Cable sitting in a car with Mathew, as he's beginning to kind of tell her that he has some sort of surprise for her. Something that is actually going to kind of change their lives for the better. Explaining that there is actually 3 surprises. 3 things that they've always wanted, and the third that he will keep for a surprise for even later on in the future. Oh Matt, come on, what? Guess. You've discovered that you're the heir to the throne of Dubrovnia. Nope. You joined the Moonies. You're really Alan Funt, and for the past 3 years I've been on candid camera. Close, but no cigar. I want a divorce. Fair enough, but you'll be sorry. Matt, if you don't tell me what the surprise is, you'll be chairbound. Oh, okay, if you're going to get violent. You want to know what the surprise is? Well, we're right now parked outside of it. And as Abby is looking out the window, we are greeted with something that looks very strangely familiar from the last story. To the actual building that Jason Blood checked into, the place where he started doing his incantations, and kind of peering into all these different people's lives. And while I don't know if these are the exact same thing, I have to say, yes, it is the exact same building. The devil checked in at noon, is what Jason Blood said. And from here on out, that is exactly what it will seem to have been. And as Abby is looking upon this beautiful building, she doesn't really know what to think. Basically, up until this point, Mathew has been a terrible drunk, a man who has been succumbed to laziness, and a man who has seemed to exhume very strange powers that he's never actually caught him doing, but she has stood outside of the door before coming home from the Elysium lawns, and she has heard the voices, and she has heard the scurrying of strange insects coming from inside. And as we get this candid shot of her face, Mathew can kind of see that she is completely thrown off bound, and he just begins to ask her whether or not she likes the house, asking her if she wants to take a look inside, and just kind of dragging her along for the ride. And so they'd gone inside. Inside, it looked even better. Matt, all this furniture, these carpets, they came with a house. The people who own this place didn't want the trouble and expense of moving them, I guess. Come on, let's look around. The living room, the kitchen. And as Mathew is showing Abby around the house, they cut to the bedroom, and something very strange happens here. Something where a veil is lifted, and Abby is once again smelling the strange smell of of beetle husks, of these things burned and decrepit. And suddenly, this vision and this scent is gone, and she begins to ask Mathew how exactly that they can afford this thing at all. Up until this point, she has been the only one to work, and Mathew Cable has, like I said, been doing nothing but drinking. But over the past couple of months, after all the strange craziness that happened at Elysium Lawns with the Monkey King, and this young child who seemed to actually be able to foresee this, whose parents were actually destroyed by this very same monster, in a terrible Ouija board accident. And all this adding up, and Mathew Cable actually going out, seeking a house, putting down a down payment, or just purchasing outright, sends Abby a little askew. She doesn't really know how this could even be possible, but this is inevitably where the second prize will come in, and we are graced by this shot of a very scary looking Mathew with this giant shit-eating grin telling her that he is about to surprise her once again. And from here, we'll be cutting to the next panel, where once again, we see a naked Abby Cable being surrounded by all these different creatures, all these different centipedes and millipedes, spiders and leeches, encroaching on her body, as we are beginning to realize that something very terrible is happening. Tentative feelers brushed against the skin of her delirium. There was the beating of miniature wings. There were arms with 2 elbows. Here was where the bad things had really started. Well, we're here. What do you think of it? What do I think of what? What do you think of the place where I work? And suddenly we're greeted to this very strange building, Black River Corporations, and something about this once again sends shivers down the back of Abby's spine. Not knowing what exactly is going on with her husband, how this new boost of confidence is just coming into play seemingly out of nowhere, or seemingly marking a very dangerous night in both of their lives. And things are just not quite adding up, when suddenly a white-haired man comes out of this building, kind of greeting Matt and his wife, as he casually asks them to both come inside, to actually see the workplace. Abby, this is Eric Loveday. Eric's my boss. Eric, this is my wife Abigail. A lovely name for a lovely young woman. Come on inside, Abby, and meet the whole sick crew. No, not inside. Don't go inside. The smell was worse inside. And inside, just for a moment, she had seen where the smell was coming from. And as Eric Loveday is opening the door into Black River Corporations, Abby notices something very strange. As the door goes open ajar, she's seeing the corpses of all these different dead people inside. And this is where the beginning of the insect smell, the burning husks of beetles will come into play. This is where it all begins. And this is where she knows that something is very, very wrong, as Abby has been through so much at this point that she is not just going to ignore some kind of supernatural event. No longer will she think that this is just Abby babble. And at this point, she is completely terrified and doesn't really know how to proceed with all this, as Eric Loveday just continues to kind of tell the tale about how Mathew showed up at this building, and now he came outside thinking that he's a new hiree merely an hour late, and somehow this led to Matt getting his job. And from here, Abby needs a moment. She needs a bit of fresh air, and Eric Loveday just kind of stops her, telling somebody else in the office to just go get her a cup of coffee, that surely it'll settle her nerves. Which I don't really know how. I know when my heart's pumping, the last thing that I need is a steaming, piping hot cup of coffee. But Abby just kind of goes on to tell them that it was just all the surprises, that her day has been so shocking, seeing her husband buy a house and get a job after all these bad things that he's done, after all the ways that he's treated her this entire time, that just all this is just building up in what seems to be a good direction, but in her heart knowing that it is not. The coffee came, and she drank it, and everything was ordinary. She met Gus Pratchett, who handled invoices, and Betty Montclair, who couldn't move her face because of a stroke. She met Sally Parks, whose name sounded familiar, and Mark Newell, who blushed when he shook her hand. The whole sick crew. And for me, when Abby says when Sally Parks sounds awfully familiar, it sounds awfully familiar to me, as I'm almost positive that this was a real-world serial killer who actually killed a bunch of different cops, a bunch of different boyfriends in different bars, and a lot of different truckers. And I think this all happened in Florida, and I guess the names are different, but their accounts are very much the same, as later on in the book we'll actually kind of recoup this Sally Parks' different events, all these things that she's done, and they're just strangely familiar. But if you want to hear more about that, go check out the episode from last podcast on the left. They cover this entire thing. It is a very gruesome tale, to say the least. But from here on out, suddenly we're cutting outside, and Abby has seemingly been transported without even knowing it, as her and Matt are making their way back to the car. And Abby basically never mentions what she actually seen behind this door. And it says that Mathew Cable never told her what corporations meant, something that is going to be a very heavy hitter later on in the future, something that is going to happen very soon. But from here, Abby looks over to Mathew and she asks him what is the third surprise, that surely any more surprise today is going to kill her, is going to send her into a shell shock for the rest of her life. And once again, we are getting this very creepy smile from Mathew himself as he says that this is going to be saved for last, at the most appropriate of times. And from here, we'll be cutting back to the house that Mathew has just purchased for him and his wife, as Abby begins to kind of account for the feelings that she had at the time, how happy all this made her feel, how it seemed like their lives were finally coming together, how the love in their marriage had seemed to make a full return, and how she finally began to notice the changes in Mathew that happened ever since that tragic night at Elysium Lawns. It was her home, and she and Matt owned it, and it was beautiful. She wasn't thinking about anything else. Why wasn't she thinking about anything else? And Matt had changed so much. All the weakness and despair had gone, leaving a new strength and an unfamiliar confidence. And then they went inside, and then there was no. And then there was the no, it didn't happen. The bad things. And she didn't want to think about it, but there was that bug taste in the back of her mouth. And no, she dug her heels into the flanks of her nightmare and made it go a different way. And then, just for a moment, she wasn't in her own dream anymore. She was in somebody else's dream. In his dream, he found a bird fallen in black grass that was sharp enough to cut your finger. Wretched and smashed, it lay like a bloodied shuttlecock, and it was dead. But it was moving. Why was it moving? His hand reached out to touch it, its eyes regarded him milky and opaque. Then, someone dropped a dark and polished stone into her dream pool, shattering the image with ripples like conjuring hoops. And then, the smell was everywhere. And then when she'd gone over to the library in Homa, where nothing strange ever happened, and reality was alphabetically filed, even there, the smell remained. And as Abby makes her way up to the front counter, she sees the attendant, and she begins to start asking her about all these different psychology books and where she could possibly find them. And the attendant asks her if she means psychology or psychiatry. And at this point, Abby begins to tell her how she works at Elysium Lawns, and all this craziness has been going on, and how she works with all these different autistic children. And she points her in the direction of the psychology section. And when Abby makes her way through, picking through all the different literature, something falls out. Something very familiar, and something that she's kind of seen in the past. And as she looks to the floor at all these books falling on the ground, she notices Sally Park's face from the Black River Corporations standing right there in the front of it. And as we're going to the next page, with once again this artwork of a naked Abby Cable surrounded by all these different bugs, it begins to tell about how she drove home the entire time with the book facing down, how she wasn't ready for the information, and upon making it back to her new acquired home, she begins to brush through the pages frantically, realizing every bad deed that Sally Parks has ever done, and she doesn't quite understand how exactly this woman made it back to the living. Sally Parks, who in the last 3 months of her 26 brief years had done many interesting and notable things. She had killed 15 people, employer's wife and teenage daughter, her own boyfriend, her boyfriend's mother, and 2 police officers, and 1 newsboy, with a variety of weapons: gun, letter opener, tire iron, wire coat hanger, for no reason at all, before being shot dead by police on the night of August 7th, 1962. That was Sally Parks, who 20 years later had a nice little job typing memos. Why hadn't she asked? Why hadn't she asked what recorporations meant? What about the rest of them? Betty Montclair, was she dead too? Eric Loveday, Gus Pritchett, Mark Newell, Matt. The shadows of the room began to spiral and whirlpool, and she clutched desperately at her train of thought. A black thread in a blacker landscape. Matt. Matt was her husband. He just didn't act like her husband. He hung around dead people and pulled jobs in houses out of nowhere. He was different. And how long had he been different? He'd been different since the night of the trouble up at Elysium Lawns, the night they'd argued. But even before that, since they were in West Virginia in fact. And what had happened in West Virginia? From deep inside her, the bad thing starts to crawl towards the light. And she knows. She knows what recorporations are. And she knows which Black River heading where. And why the dead bird moves. And who looks out from behind her husband's eyes. The smell, the burning anthill stench of it. And his name slams into her mind, and her knees buckle before its awful force. His name, a signature scrawled in acid. And she thinks, how long have I been married to? And she thinks, how many times did? And she knows what the bad thing is. is and where the stench is coming from. And this is where we'll kind of loop back to where the beginning scene of her laying on the floor, trying to scrub herself with this potato scraper, using all the soaps in the house to get rid of this bug-ridden stench, and kind of realizing all the different things that she's been doing with her so-called husband. This man who has made a complete change, buying houses and pulling jobs out of thin air, and just merely being a completely different person from the man that she once married. This man who seems to have changed ever since her uncle Anton Arcane has died. The man who Swamp Thing actually grieved. One of my favorite parts of that story is it managed to be something very beautiful, with Swamp Thing kind of admiring his enemy. This man who actually chose to be a monster, unlike Swamp Thing who was kind of forced into it. But from here, Abby realizes that the smell that has been bothering her so long, the smell of burning husks, the smell of writhing centipedes and spiders crawling around her body, and she begins to scrub away, realizing that the contamination will not go. She tries to burn her clothes, she tries to take the hottest shower that you possibly could, and once again, she is trying to scrub herself off with a potato peeler. And she realizes that even in her dreams, she cannot escape this terrible scent. And when she finally wakes up from this terrible slumber, she realizes what exactly is going on. And she begins to race around the house, trying to find all these misguarded clothes, and trying to think of a different way out. A way to get out without being noticed by Mathew before this man inevitably comes home from work. And as she scatters through the front door and begins to lurch it open, a familiar face is standing right in front of her. "Hello, hon. Hope you don't mind, but I brought some friends home." "Oh, no, come in. I ought to go to the store, get something for dinner." And as she says this, we see Eric Loveday standing next to her, as Mathew has everybody from Black River Corporation standing behind him, Sally Parks included. But what Eric Loveday actually says to her kind of brings this all into fruition, kind of showing you that they are not normal people, and that they are here to do harm, and that Mathew has possibly been somebody else this entire time. As he tells her, "Abby, don't worry about dinner. We'll take you as you are." "Your wife looks nervous, Maddie." Yes, you're right. What is it, Ab? What's the matter? Something on your mind?" I don't know who you are. Oh God. Look, please, what do you want me to say?" "What do we want you to say? Well, that's easy." And as everybody storms the house, grabbing Abby and just kind of holding her arms down, we cut to the next page where we get this awesome artwork of Anton Arcane looking directly above them all. As Matt merely just says, "Just say uncle." And finally everything has come. And the bug that once visited Mathew on a strange night when he crashed his car, completely drunk, and making some kind of deal with him, as a steering wheel imprint embraced his jaw, bring him back to life. And I really thought that this was the point where Mathew became Mathew the Raven in the Sandman series, but I guess this doesn't happen till way later on, so my bad for giving out any kind of ill information. But this kind of build up to actually meeting Anton Arcane again, and the way they kind of describe how he came back from hell, and all the different scenes and sights that he got to see, is something so awesome in this book. And some of the things that we'll see in the next video, in part 2, of Swamp Thing actually making a bit of a Dante's Inferno arc, actually making his way down to hell to claim somebody's soul. Alan Moore does such a good job at explaining the horrors of hell itself, how unforgiving it is, and how terribly awful it is, something that could maybe even top the Hellraiser franchise, without people being skinned alive obviously, but actually going into how everybody is beaten down with grief and pain, and realizing all the sins that they've come to. And the fact that hell is also guarded by a bunch of different DC characters makes it all the more better. But from here, as Mathew and everybody from Black River Corporations is holding Abigail down, we cut to the next page where Swamp Thing is finally holding up the dead burn that we've seen in Abby's dreams. And when he picks it up, he realizes that this is also not actually alive, and realizing that it is also just writhing full of these different bugs. And from here, Swamp Thing knows exactly what has been going on this entire time. He reaches out toward the bird. Is it still alive? And what causes it to writhe and twitch? It's not life, but bugs. He saw it move and thought it was alive, but it was just full of bugs. It had been full of bugs all the time. And this little allegory of Swamp Thing kind of realizing what has been going on with Mathew this whole time, hearing all these different stories through Abigail about his drinking and his sudden change in mood and this oncoming confidence that just seemed to come out of nowhere, I thought was so beautifully written, with this dead bird writhing on the floor as Swamp Thing reaches down and just realizing that it is full of bugs. The same thing that that Abby's been surrounded by, the stench of Anton Arcane himself, and this is where the story is really going to pick up. This is my absolute favorite part of it, as we'll see the powers of Anton Arcane going full out, as he reaches out everywhere around him, bringing all these different murderers and serial killers, and just kind of allowing everything bad within a 200-mile radius to happen, manifesting all these dark incidents and all these terrible deaths that people are going to encounter from here on out. And this is once again where Alan Moore's writing just absolutely shines. I think I noticed one thing when I'm reading Alan Moore is that he kind of repeats himself in a poetic way very much, but his ability to kind of foreshadow things in the beginning, to tie all these different storylines together, manages to be something so incredibly entertaining. And I gotta say, I've read about 3 or 4 Swamp Thing volumes after this one in particular, and this one just remains to be the best, alright? It's something that really has a hard payoff ever since the very beginning of the first Alan Moore Swamp Thing issue, and it's just really something that I have not seen topped yet. But with this next issue of A Halo of Flies, we will see the powers of Hell in Anton Arcane fleshed out through all of Louisiana. The Return Man smiles, and outside, the Louisiana sky soars from rim to rim, curdling the November clouds. The Return Man chuckles, and a shockwave of nightmare ripples out across the sleeping continent. And in Lafayette, Jody Herbert comes across the wino passed out in an alleyway, and Jody has a book of matches in his pocket, and there's nobody else around. And in Alexandria, Tina Louise Pierce says, "The hell with it," and lifts the ancient iron frying pan that her husband is too cheap to replace. And in Shreveport, Jim and Carol Patterson's pet cat Spook decides that their son Ricky's crib is a warm place to sit. And in Lake Charles, a guide dog suddenly grows irritated with its master. And on a farm 3 miles west of Crowley, something terrible is born that cries like a woman and then dies. And in Homa, Abigail Cable just can't stop screaming. And the Return Man looks upon his works, and he sees that they are good. And with all these different terrible events just kind of reaching across the entire continent, the one that really catches my eye is the baby born at a farm. This thing born from a cow that screams like a woman and then immediately dies. And to me, I immediately think the Antichrist, but thankfully this isn't a problem, because it's already gone. But this idea of all these different terrible things just kind of happening everywhere all at once is something that I found really cool, and something that Alan Moore is actually going to be playing around with a little more later on in the story. But from here on out, we will see Abigail Cable being pinned to the ground by all these corpses, all these festering beings filled with bugs and gnats and flies just surrounding their everyday bodies, as Anton Arcane is finally going to tell us just how he actually made his way out of hell. "Ah, but you are pale, my darling, though not I think so pale as we. Be still, my charner lily, do not tremble. Your uncle has a yarn to tell, a joke, a bedtime story, a tale of how it was when I was dead. My eye imploded, and the phosphorus shrieked through my arteries. I heard a deafening chord crash out upon 1,000 harps. There are better ways to lose one's grip from off the throat of life. It was my failure that shriveled me." And with this amazing artwork of Anton Arcane's eye just exploding out of nowhere, we will basically see his soul travel all throughout hell, and he will begin to tell us the story of how he went from body to body. The first being a spider, being even more lowly than a beetle, and then it was so insignificant that it couldn't actually hold his consciousness, and it merely just died once again. And this only sent Anton even farther out, actually sending him down into the deeper pits of hell, and a lake of people shrieking in pain with grief and suffering, to a land of boneless men. And as he's making his way through this lake of people who can't seem to climb out, saying that their souls are too dense and filled with sin and terrible things, and his abilities to adapt seem to lend him a hand to reach further. Poisoners and traitors, tyrants and torturers, their evil was massive, and had a gravity and a cold psychic undertow that dragged at my awareness. But I struggled free from fingers without blood or bone or sinew, making my way back to the bleached hemisphere beyond, back to my discarded clay, as a serpent will return to fresh loud skin. It lay there in the dirt, so small, so diminished. It was a thing of staring. And as Anton is talking about how he kind of escaped all these different bodies in the bowels of hell, he manages to actually find his old body up in the real world. This body that does seem dead, but somehow he is able to actually position himself within it. And from there, he just kind of unleashes his soul off into the world. And he actually explains that he was looking for any rags that he could possibly get into, henceforth being Mathew Cable, and in trying to do so, he needed to put himself in the mind of a bug, something small, something that Mathew Cable would not recognize. recognize, and at a very specific moment in time when he would be desperate enough. And this is exactly when Abigail Cable realizes just what her uncle has done this whole time. These terrible things of actually taking over her husband's mind and doing basically everything a husband would do at this point. It's a very heavy segment in this book where she kind of realizes how long that she's been with this man and all these different activities that they've kind of fordued with, and yeah, it's a lot of naughty nastiness, and Anton Arcane manages to be one of the most evil villains that I think I've come across in a long time. A person who is willing to just do evil for evil's sake. And later on, he will start to explain that because of his death, because of his early leave from Earth, this is what's caused so much hatred for Swamp Thing himself, as well as his niece, and it's something that I'd like to know, to make go back before Alan Moore's run of Swamp Thing, to actually get to know Anton Arcane just a little bit more. Honestly, have no idea about, alright? I've only heard mentions of him, and I've only seen his dead body in Volume 1, so if there's like a critical moment in comic book history where maybe you could find me a good like 5-6 arc run of Anton Arcane, something that can bolster my knowledge and comic book lore for the Swamp Thing, I would absolutely love that. But what Anton does next with all these people from Black River Corporations holding her down is he begins to explain that her grasp of the inhuman realm is very shallow, and that to take Mathew Cable's body in the first place, he needed to kind of agree to this himself, and he did this very willingly. In a moment of desperation, when he was losing his life, and the only thing he wanted to do was to go help his wife after a terrible moment where he could have made the right decision and ended up doing the wrong, that this was the time to strike, to pull over the drapes of his new body, and to go on. And from here, he also begins to explain the weaknesses that Mathew Cable had, these strange powers that Abigail never necessarily knew about, these strange sensual illusions that Mathew had been playing with in Abby's absence, and his loneliness and his desperation for the touch of his wife. With him, it was a monstrosity of lust, of aberrations nurtured and weaknesses indulged. A fluke of the brain had given your husband abilities to shake what gods there be, the power to bend the world, and to make dreams touchable. He squandered it on trivial and squalid dioramas, trout-skinned women with luster of neon, women of smoke, mannequins textured like apricots. And from here, Abby cannot take any more. These are things that she never knew about her husband, and she always thought that he was a sweet man with just a little bit of demons inside of him. And while this is the case, and the thing that we've seen through Swamp Thing Volume 1 and 2 is every time he's alone, we always see clothes pop up in a human-like shape. In one instance, actually telling it to bow and apologize after a big fight with Abigail, and she basically just covers her ears and begins to scream. When we get this giant candid shot of Arcane just holding her face down and telling her, yes, this is the man that you've always loved, and there's nothing that I did that forced him to do any of this. Telling her that Mathew has actually beaten his own path down the hill, and the only thing that he needed to do to take over his body was to wait and watch. And after all this, he begins to explain his plan, how he actually put all these different events in motion that would lead Mathew Cable to actually crashing his car into the tree, these carefully placed moments on the timeline, like the Ouija board, like these people being stabbed by the swordfish, and like the Monkey King coming out and terrorizing the school at Elysium Lawns. And when it came down to it, when he became the fly that would eventually talk to Mathew Cable in the car, he talks about it as being a stroke of mercy, and that Mathew Cable surrendered his flesh so willingly. And the hatred that Arcane actually holds for Abigail, I still have no idea. I don't know what she necessarily did that would cause his death in the first place, for his body and his ship to plummet to the ground and finally lend a death blow to this man who seems to have never been stricken with any kind of fear or with any kind of pain, and ended up being Swamp Thing's nemesis for so long. Anton Arcane just seems purely evil to be evil. And as he's explaining that her husband's husk is now his to wear, he tells Abigail that his powers as well are his to hold. And he screams into the night air, saying, I am Anton Arcane, as we see all these different hands from hell reaching up and pulling Abigail under the ground. And once again, we see Arcane's power reach even farther outside of Louisiana, reaching nearly 200 miles, if not more, if not spanning the entire continent. And once again, all this terrible craziness, all this murder, and every bad thought that anybody's ever had is coming into the real world, being manifested in reality. And in Monroe, Hetty Duplantis remembers her sister Doreen, how sick and quite helpless, how she used to torment her when she was a child. And in Little Rock, Cheryl and Lonnie Williams wait until their father and their slutty new stepmother are asleep before playing with the kitten he bought her. And in Bayamont, all the tropical fish at the First Water Pet Shop begin to eat first each other, and then themselves. And in Springfield, there is a brief and spectacular plague of ladybugs. And beneath the earth, there are muffled booming voices. And beneath the ocean, there are terrible lights. And with the terrible lights thing, I don't know if these are like UFOs underneath the water or some kind of secret civilization, but that part right there in particular really had me going. I needed to know more, but I could not find any information on just what exactly things are. But I think Alan Moore is just dipping everywhere, alright? He's going past murder. And he's actually going into a little bit of like existential dread, maybe just some unknown terror that H.P. Lovecraft would have loved so much. And I just found these scenes where everything is going so wrong across the entire continent to be very well written. And with the next couple of panels, we're going to be meeting some people that I just have no idea who they are. They seem to be some kind of watcher, and this lady who accompanies him out in space, and this really cool looking golden spaceship as they're wondering just what exactly is going on. Monitor, I think something's happening in Louisiana. I'm getting a wave portrait around 800. The 800s, let me see. And as this mysterious man is just sitting in his chair, he's noticing all these power levels just going off. And he merely mentions that the only people that could utilize this kind of power is the Spectre and Trigun from Teen Titans. Raven's dad, which I thought was very interesting once again. It's somebody that I've actually seen in DC's, I believe, but it's once again not a character that I know too much about other than watching Teen Titans when I was a kid. And I just kind of love how this book is beginning to bring in all these different characters. And with the next couple of panels, we'll actually get to see Jason Woodrue once again, just losing his mind in Arkham Asylum, and the Joker doing something that he's never done before. And the ripples widen across America, shimmering like liquid chromium through the very darkest minds, the desperate and the depraved and the deranged. Come on, Woodrue, easy now. The Bayou, coming out of the Bayou. What the hell is wrong with them all tonight? Beats me. Woodrue just went berserk and started up whacking his head against the cell door. Trouble is, an enemy like that, who can say how bad he's hurt himself? How do they expect us to cope with freaks like these? I helped sedate Two-Face earlier. Oh yeah? You want to see something really scary? The Joker stopped laughing, and the waves roll out, swelling upon a fever tide, their blackness unveiled by foam. And the return man gestures with a stolen hand and dismisses his servants, and then goes out walking, shirtless, in the freezing fog, and after a while, it begins to snow. And with Anton Arcane making his final move and actually leaving this house, leaving the people from Black River Corporation to do their own bidding, we are slowly coming upon the last issue that I will be covering in this video today. The final fight between Swamp Thing and Arcane as they finally meet each other once again. And as Swamp Thing doesn't really care too much for Anton Arcane, he doesn't really want to play these weird games once he finds out what's going on, Arcane cannot have this. And his cruelness is stepped up tenfold, and this is what's going to lead us into our second video, when Swamp Thing actually needs to go down to hell to fetch a few different people, to make kind of a journey, and to bring us into one of the coolest love stories that I think I've ever seen in comic book history. But as the snow is falling all across Louisiana, we cut to the next panel, and we see Swamp Thing walking up to the old house, and almost immediately is met with a nemesis that he was sure was really dead. As he hears Anton Arcane say his name, and then suddenly a burst stream of destruction, a giant fireball depends down at his feet. And as Swamp Thing is thrown to the ground, he looks up, and the only person's face that he can see is Mathew, and he's very unsure of exactly what's going on. And Anton Arcane begins to tell him that Mathew no longer exists. He tells him to guess again, and immediately Swamp Thing says, Arcane. And suddenly, he is flooded with a power that we've never seen before. I am returned, and the energies that churn within me are limitless, as my very great need for revenge. Then why does one so powerful waste so much time with talk? Because your eventual destruction is already a fact, accomplished in absolute, and because I desire to see you dance one final clumsy, desperate waltz. And as Anton Arcane begins to laugh maniacally out into the midnight sky, Swamp Thing merely tells him to just kill him, that he will not be doing any sort of dance for him. And what Anton does after that is tell him, I have Abigail. And with the next panel, Alec Holland begins to walk out into the snow. And in Homa, a young sailor on shore leave asks Sally Parks to excuse him. It's just that he knows her face from somewhere. And outside Lafayette, Jody Herbert suddenly decides to take a ride up to the bayou. And Gus Pritchett gazes out over the schoolyard, abandoned in shadow, and thinks how swell it is to be back. And in Monroe, Hattie Duplantis shudders and resolves to go for a walk, rather than think about the mess in the bedroom. And Mark Newell has found a car, and everything bad within 200 miles finds itself heading for Louisiana without knowing why. And the return man walks home to prepare for his many visitors. And finally, we see Anton Arcane hovering above the house, waiting for Swamp Thing to enter. And as Alec does, he begins to walk up the stairs to the new acquainted bedroom. And what he sees there is Abigail's unconscious body, or at least so he thinks for now. And he basically shudders to himself, realizing that Abigail is actually dead. This person that he's loved for so long, and this person that he's never really got to actually enunciate these words to her. These two that seem like they were destined to be together, whether he's a giant swamp man or not, he deserves it, he deserves the love, and Abigail also deserves him, because there's clearly a connection here. And what Anton has done is basically played one of the cruelest games that he possibly could. And it doesn't really stop here, as Anton really does seem to be pretty desperate just to make Swamp Thing very upset, to make him angry, and to actually make him want to fight him. But what he doesn't really realize is that Swamp Thing is literally of the earth, holds the entire power of the earth, and that Anton Arcane is merely something cast out of hell itself. And with the next couple of panels, Alec Holland picks up Abigail's frail body, and he walks outside and finally confronts the man that's caused all this pain, all this torture, throughout so many different families, throughout so many children's lives, and most importantly, through the love of Swamp Thing's life. How long has she been dead? I close my eyes, and she is alive, in the private night behind my eyelids. The smell of her skin, in the diluted autumn sunlight, the fine white hairs upon her neck, upon her arms, and then I open, and Abby is still dead. Behind me, the laughter of my enemy, rattling in another man's throat. His creatures swarm about us, coagulations from the tainted air. She must not remain in this place. His presence corrupts its timbers. The walls are sodden with vileness. To think I mourned him once when he was dead. One final clumsy, desperate waltz. That is what he promised me. Beneath my fingertips, the banister becomes a ribcage, and raw and exposed. I stumble through his crooked house, her cold still weight crushed to my breast. She must not remain in this place. And suddenly, as Alec Holland makes his way outside, Anton Arcane reaches up to the sky, and the entire place explodes, sending Swamp Thing across the air with Abigail's body still in hand, as Anton Arcane asks Swamp Thing if he knows desperation yet, if he knows sadness, and if he knows despair. And Swamp Thing merely tells him that he didn't need to take Abigail's life to teach him this, that this is something he's basically lived through, this entire tragedy of him becoming this swamp beast, this unknown creature, and this thing that can never really truly be accepted by humanity. And Anton just fishes harder to make this man upset, to bring tears to his eyes, and what he tries to do next only proves this. Never fear, I have some good news. She isn't dead at all. It was all a hoax. That breathless carcass that you cradle so pathetically, that isn't even her. That's just a construct, formed with abilities I stole from Mathew Cable, along with his flesh. Aren't you angry at the way you've been deceived? Why don't you rip the construct's head off? You know, as a gesture of defiance. You lie. This is Abby, and she is dead. And what Anton says next is a callback to the very first page of the very first volume of Elmore's Swamp Thing run, when Swamp Thing is mourning over Anton's body, and he keeps saying that he just needed to come back, that he needed to check that Anton is actually dead. Really dead. And this is exactly what Anton says to Swamp Thing. Yes, really dead. As he pulls up the craziest smile that you've ever seen, in the most evil way that he possibly could. And what he does next is tell Swamp Thing that not only did he kill Abigail, but he ripped her soul straight out of her body and sent her straight to hell just to hear her scream. And essentially telling Swamp Thing that when Anton was sent down to hell, this was the power that he gained on his arrival back. The ability to send any kind of innocent soul down for absolutely no reason. And this isn't the only thing that he gained. He continues to go on that when he was in the sea of all these soulless people, all these people damned and tormented, that he brought the cream of the crop back with him. You murdered me, Holland. You and Crippman and pale cold Abigail, launching me upon a fleshless odyssey through the dismal waters. Dark flotsam bobbed upon those tides, and I brought some back with me, the cream of the gallows and the aristocracy of hell. They are returned, and they are out now, celebrating their new skin in the darkness. Sally Parks, flirting in Homa 22 years after a police marksman made a small hole in her forehead, a larger one at the back. And Gus Pritchett, plump and fatherly, who smothered children in abandoned refrigerators and went to the electric chair in 1964. And Betty Montclair, who killed herself in a garage after committing a crime that cannot easily be put into words. And Mark Newell and Eric Loveday. They are returned, and they are but the first. and it is the apocalypse. My apocalypse. And as Anton says this, we get this amazing piece of artwork showing Anton's jaw outstretched with bugs flying out of his mouth and basically just enveloping Swamp Thing. And from here telling Alec Holland to run, that there is no longer any rock for him to hide in, and that there are no celestial forces that could possibly stop this. But when he says this, he is wrong, and we are cutting back to the Watchmen, these people who are just kind of gravitating over the earth, and watching this power expand across the entire United States, as something that's never happened before happens now. Monitor, what's happening in Louisiana? Monitor, I said, I heard what you said. Please do not disturb me. I'm concentrating. I am attempting to suppress for the first time in my life the uncontrollable urge to look away. And as Alec Holland continues to run, he notes to himself that he cannot stop now, that he can no longer afford any more weaknesses or any more mistakes, that there's been far too many signs and things ignored, dreams that went unquestioned, and warnings unheeded, and the omens ignored. And this is the final battle. And with all these different shots from past events throughout the entirety of Swamp Thing, we just see Anton Arcane following Swamp Thing and a cold, dead Abigail Cable running through the woods, until inevitably we start to see a green patch. And what this actually is the swampland that Alec Holland resides in, a place of power and a place that is yet to be untouched by Anton Arcane. And this is where Anton gets a little bit too overconfident that there's nowhere left to run on Earth, that he only allows Alec Holland to live any longer. And it's at this point that Anton has completely forgotten that he's never really faced this version of Alec Holland, this man who is not Alec Holland anymore, but something completely and separately different. And Swamp Thing knows this, and he uses this to his advantage, telling Anton that there is no need for running anymore. Don't be ridiculous, Holland. What are you talking about? You have made a mistake, Arcane. Things have changed. I am not Holland. I am Swamp Thing. I am of the clean earth. I am in my place of power, and you should not have come here. And with this, Alec Holland punches Arcane directly in his chest, and this sends Arcane flying in a bout of shock, as he doesn't really know how this man could possibly hurt him, and once again forgetting that the man that he used to know is no longer the man that stands in front of him. And as Anton grovels about how Swamp Thing has no magic, and that surely this just must be some kind of power from the earth, Swamp Thing agrees, telling him that they've never battled before, and that he's never met this version of himself. This is our final battle. You claim the earth for your own, Arcane. You have not 1/10 of the earth's power. You mock God. You make the world worthless with your lies. How dare you? And as Alec is slamming Arcane into the ground, all these different apparitions and all these different people that Arcane has brought up from hell begin to sort of lose themselves, to begin to kind of lose their place in the world, as hundreds of these people are walking towards Louisiana and suddenly stop, not knowing where they're going. And once again, we are cutting over to Sally Parks, who has no idea why the sailor underneath her is screaming, until she feels a trickle of blood running down her face. And when she goes to investigate, realizing that she is melting completely. And with the next panel, we see Black River corporations liquefying and smelling of a dead and rotten meat. And deep within Arcane himself, something is beginning to stir. A character who has been taken away from his own body, and who at this point has the power to stop everything that's been going on. Anton begins screaming that this flesh is mine, and telling the man that lives within inside him to leave him alone, that they had made a bargain. And this is finally the return of Mathew Cable, emerging from the surfaces underneath his skin and making the final choice that will stop everything. No, you stole it from me, and then you killed Abby. You were too strong for me to challenge you before. Cable, the power is waning, please. Remember the car crash. It's only the power that keeps the body alive. Good, we both deserve it, just as long as I get to send you where you set my wife. Goodbye, Arcane. And as Mathew Cable says this, Swamp Thing closes his eyes, as Anton Arcane lets out a shrieking terror as he begins to fall and fall and fall further back to hell, knowing of what awaits him. And this is one of the best parts in the next book, is when we actually get to meet Arcane down in hell. And the emotions that are portrayed in that are extremely terrifying and way too real, honestly. But as Anton falls back to the black pits from whence he came, the only person left is Mathew Cable, looking battered as all the marks from the car crash begin to emerge, holes in his chest, and his jaw begins to break. Hello, Alec. Arcane has gone, but you are hurt. These wounds that open. I'm dying, but it's for the best after what I let him do. Matt, he possessed you. His was the only evil. No, I let him. I was weak. There isn't any evil, Alec. No special blackness reserved for demons and monsters. There's just weakness. I had a choice. Matt, you are rambling in your power. Can't you repair yourself? And at this point, Mathew Cable does the only thing sensible. The only thing that he could possibly do to make everything right with Abigail Cable. This woman who's taken a backseat to her entire life, being told a lie for the last 3 months, after doing nothing but caring for children, caring for her husband, and caring for everybody around her. A truly sweet person who, throughout this entire comic book, honestly is my second tier favorite character. And that there is only one person here who deserves to be repaired. And this is exactly what he does. And as Alec Holland begins to get excited, Mathew begins to crawl towards Abigail, grabbing her by the forearms and noting that he needs to get her heart pumping, that he needs to deteriorate all the coagulated blood in her circulatory system. And as her body begins to warm and her heart begins to pound, there is one thing left to do, and Mathew Arcane must reach as far as he can, deep into the bowels of hell, to actually reach her soul and pull it back up to Earth. And as we cut to the next couple of panels, we see his arm reaching in the blackness, and we see Abigail's as well, and with the next panel after, we just see this terrible set of tentacles pulling Abby down back to the blackness. And Anton begins to cry, noting how sorry he is, and with this, Swamp Thing himself is absolutely devastated. Kneeling down before Mathew Cable, this person that he's used to have such a long relationship with, as the man lies there dying, when suddenly a cop car shows up, and we get this little bit of a scene of these two police officers just kind of talking about all these different events that they've kind of unfolded throughout the night, all these different murderers who have seemed to come back, and all these dark incidents that have been happening across the entire state, with cats smothering babies, with strange creepers being born from cows that let out a shriek and then die, and with a strange old woman who grabbed her old frying pan and beat her husband to death with it. And as they continue talking about the events that have occurred over the night, they see Mathew Cable's body laying down on the ground. What is it, Bobby? Why'd you pull over? Is it, oh, this guy's been in some kind of accident, alright. He had hardly breathing, got steering column fractures, the works. Looks that way, but where's his car? Not like this, who gives a damn? Come on, let's get him on our car. Maybe we can get him to the hospital in time. Yeah, geez, look at all this blood. I only just got through cleaning up after that sailor. And with our final page, after the police officers drive away, we are cutting back to Swamp Thing as he reaches down to the ground and begins to pick up Abby's newly warmed body, noticing that something has vanished from her. She lies where I left her. She breathes. Her heart beats. But a heartbeat is not a woman. A breath is not Abby. And when I open them, Abby is still dead. And that is finally the end of this part of the video. Alright, this massive book and the biggest video that I think I have ever done thus so far, and I think part 2 is nearly going to be just about the same, as it only has 1 or 2 different issues that could probably be left out for the sake of brevity. But overall, I think Love and Death is a very tragic story that shows one of our favorite characters in the Swamp Thing universe being completely taken advantage of. Somebody who's been so sweet throughout the entirety of the franchise thus so far, and I think you could almost say that Abigail Cable is probably the main character of this book, that Swamp Thing's part probably isn't even as big as her. But when it comes down to it, Love and Death is just such a fantastic tale. Finally tying up all these different storylines that have been going on for so long, between Mathew, between Abby, between Etrigan and the Monkey King, as well as Swamp Thing's grief over Anton Arcane in the very first volume, everything is finally wrapped up in just the most darkest and most terrible of ways. But once again, like I said, Alan Moore is just one hell of a writer. A man who can touch on so many different stories from any kind of superhero as well as his own works. Between V for Vendetta and Watchmen, as well as The Lizard in the Glass, this is a man who has touched on so many different tales between the comic book medium and books themselves, to short stories and TV shows and movies. Alan Moore is the king. And I gotta say, after this nearly 3-hour recording, my arms are a little bit sore from holding this giant special edition version of Swamp Thing. But it is something that I think you should check out. I think if you've already read the previous original issues, this is something for the collector's shelf. This neat little book that seems to be glowing in the light of this thing. With its velvet cover and brief introductions into the writings of Alan Moore, as well as the people who took over for the first issue when everybody was just a little bit too busy trying to wrap up everything that would happen in the future. And it's a thing that I cherish in my collection. At this point, I own the original copies of the storyline, I own Absolute Swamp Thing, which is this book, and on top of that, I also own the original box set. And that is exactly how much I love Swamp Thing. Nearly $200 worth of Swamp Thing books, all being the same exact story. But anyways, everybody, I've been recording this video for nearly 3 hours at this point, and I am incredibly tired, and my brain is just a little bit dead. So hopefully I did a good job at retelling that story. Like I said, I've tried so many different times, and a lot of the times when I'm recording these videos, sometimes I just cannot get past the intro. I always want it to be very interesting, something that's captivating, that kind of gets people to, one, obviously watch past the 30-second mark, but to just be intriguing, and not just to be a man rambling in a room. But yes, this is such a long story, and after a certain amount of time, I just begin to start having a sort of brain fog, and it begins a little bit hard to just keep continuing, and continuing, and continuing. We literally just did half of this entire book, alright, in one sitting, I must say. Even the last video on Swamp Thing wasn't nearly this long, and that video ended up being over 53 minutes, making me feel like I had just made a small movie, and I'm hoping that I can do that again. I'm hoping this one will be around an hour 30, maybe a little shorter, maybe a little longer, but something that I can really pride myself on telling such a giant story. And the things that come next are also just as fantastic, something that I might even like a little bit more than this story, as we'll actually get to see Swamp Thing going on a bit of a Dante's Inferno arc all the way through hell to fetch Abby's soul. We'll also get to be seeing Arcane, as well as a bunch of other characters that I know who they are, but don't necessarily know their origin stories and things like that. And on top of all this, we'll actually also get to see Abigail Cable going into the Sandman universe, as she'll actually get to meet Cain and Abel, two characters from that universe that are just very tragic. Cain is always killing Abel in the worst kinds of ways, treating him very terribly, and it just really makes me happy to think that maybe Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman are two people in one. And it really just makes me happy to think of Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman as friends, as they're two substantial writers. I mean, my god. Neil Gaiman is a household name, at least in my house. My girlfriend's been reading all the books, I've been reading all the different graphic novels, watching the shows, and I think they're two people that just kind of go in tandem. But yes, everybody, I really hope you guys enjoyed this. If you stuck all the way through the end, I thank you so much, and I totally would not blame you if you ended up watching this thing in parts, as I know it's going to be extremely long, and there's only one more shout out that I need to do. If you heard any cool kind of horror lo-fi music in this, it is from Ill-Advised Records, my latest obsession, a man who makes all these different kinds of dark lo-fi, spanning from all sorts of different horror movies to different just terrible samples. And on top of that, he makes all these super cool mixtapes, things that you can get in a physical release, and it's something that I've just really been appreciating. And there's also just one more thing that I really want to get into, is that if you go to his website, you can purchase something called The Dark Door. This is a little publication where it kind of reaches out to a bunch of different people online, and you can submit stories to him, and he'll buy them for a lower fee, as he's just one guy in Canada, and it's something that I'd really like to try out. I'd like to write my own short story and possibly submit this into his work and see if I can maybe get accepted. And if you could all possibly go to his channel and tell him to maybe do an interview with From the Heart, this man who appreciates his music so much, that would be kind of cool. But do not harass this guy, alright? I just really want to talk to him. But yes, Ill-Advised Records, you are much appreciated over here on yet another channel that really appreciates the horror sides of things, and I just want to say thank you for allowing me to actually use some of your music. I made sure to go buy a shitload of cassette tapes, as well as the signed Dark Door book and a signed cassette player, and I've been listening to these things every single time I sit down and read anything spooky, especially your book. But yes, everybody, I'm out of here. I need to get out of this room. I need to drink some water. I need to take a nap. I've never done such a long recording and been so completely worried that it's not going to be good, because this is going to take an absolute assload of editing, my biggest project yet, and I don't even know where I'm gonna go after this. My mouth is getting numb and I can no longer think, so yes, everybody, please tell me what you think in the comments. Tell me how much you love Alan Moore, tell me how much you dislike Alan Moore, and tell me what your very favorite arc of Swamp Thing is, of this magical beast that has taken over my mind. And have yourself an absolutely amazing day. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next episode of From the Heart.